Welcome, everyone. I'm Amber Kaiser, and I'm here with Dr. Katie Tolbert to talk about how the Dog Aging Project is studying diet in dogs. So this conversation, I just wanted to let you know, with Dr. Tolbert has been pre-recorded. We reached out to our Dog Aging Project PAC members on the Dog Park Forum to get questions in advance. So we'll be focusing on those today. My apologies that we won't be able to address live time questions, but please go ahead and put questions and comments in the chat when you're watching this broadcast, or you can either put them in the chat below the video, or you can add them to the Dog Park Forum thread. We will definitely try to address those questions after the broadcast. And you are also entered to win our monthly giveaway for every question or comment that you put into the chat on the Dog Park Forum or here. If you are wondering how to get to the Dog Park Forum, there's a link to the Q&A thread that will be in the description of this video below. All right, so logistics out of the way, I am really excited to introduce you to Dr. Katie Tolbert.
Hello. Hey, how's it going?
So good to see you. Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. I'm happy to be here.
So Dr. Tolbert and I have had the pleasure of working on the diet research in the Dog Aging Project, and we're super excited to talk about it today. I thought maybe what we'd do to start out is have you tell our audience a little bit about your background, why you pursued a career in veterinary medicine, and what your current research interests are.
Yeah, it's not very romantic, but so I was really unsure of what I wanted to do with my life. As you know, like you have to pick in college, and that can be very stressful.
Pressure.
So I knew that I wanted to do something in the medical field, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to do it in the human or the animal medical field. I actually applied to both graduate school at Emory because I'm from Atlanta, and then also vet school at UGA. And the UGA letter, the UGA letter came first. So I ended up going to vet school, which is not, that's just how I was like rolling. Yeah, but then I'm really glad I did because I really fell in love with it. I wasn't sure really what I wanted to do. I thought maybe I'd go into general practice until I got into my 4th year of vet school, which is the clinical year. And then I fell in love with clinics, and I realized I wanted to get more training. So then I stayed on for an internship at UGA. And then I decided I really loved internal medicine. So I went and did a residency at North Carolina State University, where I also did a PhD as well during that time. And then I practiced internal medicine for a little while, losing track of years, to be honest, maybe 10 years. And then really loved that, was really enjoying what I was doing. I was predominantly doing mostly GI diseases, gastrointestinal diseases of dogs and cats, and really loved that. But realized that a lot of times nutrition was fixing the problem. And maybe the problem was more me, that I didn't know how to pick the right diet. And so then that's when I started getting interested in doing a nutrition residency. And so I am very slowly working my way now through a small animal nutrition residency.
That's super fascinating. I know we have some questions about the connection between GI disease and nutrition, so that'll be awesome for us to talk about a little bit later. So I think it might help to give our audience just a little bit of the big picture, right? Most of you who are watching know that the goal of the Dog Aging Project is to study how genes, environment, and lifestyle affect healthy aging in dogs. So I guess I'll throw it back to you. Why do you think that nutrition, or studying nutrition and diet in dogs, is such an important area of this research?
Yeah, and again, I think it's the reason why I got into the residency, is because I understood that nutrition can be the cause and consequence of disease, but also can be curative in some situations. So it really has a profound impact on the outcome of dogs' health and wellness. And so I think this is an obvious, maybe more important sometimes than studying pharmaceuticals, is actually looking at the impact of nutrition, because I think in certain cases you can have more of an impact.
So I'm trained as a geneticist. I also went to UGA, by the way. So Go dogs.
Go dogs.
So, and when we're thinking about the interaction between genes and environment on what we call phenotype, right? The things we observe in dogs, nutrition is part of that sort of environment bucket, right? So what are some of the unique challenges in studying diet or nutrition?
Yeah, I think just what you just said is the heterogeneity is like this idea of nutrigenomics, where there's this interaction between a dog's genetics and then nutrition, because some dogs can be very susceptible to diseases as a result of their genetics and then the diet they eat, and others cannot be. Like a good example of that in the recent literature would be this idea behind dilated cardiomyopathy in dogs, where we find that some dogs are really susceptible to development of dilated cardiomyopathy when eating certain diets, whereas others are not. And that's probably a result of the interplay between genetics, nutrition, and then other environmental factors. So I think the difficulty is really, again, the heterogeneity. Sometimes it's like you may not see an effect because you have such a heterogeneous population. So I think that's the strength of the dog aging project, isn't it? That the more numbers that you have, the more you're able to tease out some of those patterns.
Right. Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up because, we are following tens of thousands of dogs in the dog aging project and taking, massive amounts of genetic information and combining it with health information and with the survey information that our participants complete. So shout out to those of you out there in the audience who complete our surveys. They're really important because that allows us to sort of disentangle those interactions between genes and environment. And you just can't do it if you're only looking at 100 dogs, or if you're only looking at golden retrievers, or, only looking at dogs who eat a particular kind of diet. You have to sort of look at it all. One of the things, just sort of still thinking about the challenges of studying nutrition that you and I talked about that I thought was really interesting was how in a lot of ways it's easier to study nutrition in dogs than in humans. Partially because humans have a much more varied diet, but also I remember one of the things you said in one of our conversations was that humans aren't very truthful about their diets. Like, I am not going to admit that I had 2 bowls of ice cream last night. So studying dogs, clearly you made the good choice to go into veterinary medicine because the patients are much, much easier.
Yeah, if only they filled out their own diet surveys.
Yeah. But they might lie too. Like, I didn't have that extra raw too last
true.
night. No, I didn't.
That's true.
I didn't steal that bag of treats from the counter. So I wanted to tell people a little bit about the original way we started studying diet. So for those of you out there who are PAC members, you will recall that the first thing that happened when you joined the Dog Aging Project PAC was that you completed the Health and Life Experience survey. Took you a couple of hours, probably. We asked you many, many questions about everything from like how many fish tanks you have in your home to the kinds of food that you're feeding your dog. And that initial diet section in the Health and Life Experience survey was pretty short. But it provided us some really interesting information. And I think I can share my screen and show you a little bit of an overview. Hold on one second. Let me get to the right place. All right, technology, don't fail me now. Okay, cool. So this is a data dashboard that is available at data.dogagingproject.org. We'll put it in the chat and in the follow-up post from this. This gives us a snapshot of data from dogs in the PAC just for the year 2021. This is the dashboard. This is where you land first. It has the sections of the Health and Life Experience survey listed here. If you click on one, like the diet survey, it'll actually pop up a PDF of the kinds of questions we ask. So the first question, how many times per day is your dog fed? But if you go back to the dashboard, click on diet, the little bone over on the left side, you'll actually see a summary of this information. So if you look, I think you can see that highlight when I do it. If you look at that first section, you'll see that 73% of the dogs in the pack during 2021 were fed twice a day. If you look down at primary component of diet, a key question, you'll see the vast majority of those dogs were being fed a regular, dry, commercial kibble diet. Interesting, like there were 355 dogs in the pack who were feeding a raw diet. So we're getting a lot of information about these different kinds of diets. So I invite you all to spend a little time just exploring this if you want. Just remember that it's a summary and also that it's just from 2021. Also, as we sort of looked at this diet information coming in from the original diet section of Health and Life Experience Survey, we found that we wanted to know more, right? So Dr. Tolbert and several of our other veterinary researchers and I got together to try to figure out how we could get more information and maybe better information for us to get a little bit more in depth. So if you join the Dog Aging Project now, or as soon as you get your annual follow-up survey, if you're already a member of the pack, you'll see that the new diet section is pretty different. I thought I might give just a little overview of that. And Katie, feel free to chime in if I'm forgetting things that you think I should mention. But we added some of the updates to the new diet section. We have much more detailed information about feeding frequency. Some of you may have seen recent news about results coming out of the Dog Aging Project about associations between feeding frequency and health measures. We can share some of that information, I think, in the follow-up post as well. But we wanted to know more about that. You know, in particular, what's the interval? Like not only how many times a day are you feeding your dog, but what's the interval between those feeding times? We ask some general questions about weight history, like has a dog ever been overweight or underweight? And then the key things that we were really trying to do better in this new diet survey, we're capturing diet components. So even though most people are feeding a pretty simple diet of dry kibble, they might be supplementing that occasionally with, I don't know, pumpkin or a vitamin supplement or a mineral supplement, or and then we wanted to capture treats, right? I remember one time that we were talking about this, you mentioned, Dr. Tolbert, that treats were an under-recognized portion of a dog's total food consumption. So I don't know, do you have anything you wanted to tell people about what you were thinking about when we were designing those treat questions?
Yeah, I mean, treats are really hard because people think of them as just that, treats for your, expressing your love for your dog, or you're recognizing a good behavior, and so you're wanting to, honor that. But they bring in quite a bit of calories sometimes, and they're not formulated to be complete and balanced. Like when a pet food company comes in and they're making a food, they have very specific requirements in terms of like protein, fat, essential amino acids, essential fatty acids, minerals, vitamins, that sort of thing. Treats, because they're intended for supplemental use, they're not intended to provide any nutrition necessarily. They can quickly unbalance a dog's food. And so if you forget to also take into account the impact of treats, you may miss something that is there, but you couldn't see it because you forgot about the treats.
So we ask pretty detailed questions about the kind of treats, how many treats, how frequently treats are being fed, and really try to frame that in the new diet section as one piece of the overall diet. Side story, I had a bag of dog jerky treats on the counter, and my son ate them all. He thought they were human jerky treats, so good times for that. And he's like, I'm like, what happened to the dog treats? And he's like, oh, I ate those. He's like 17. And I'm like, okay, how were they? And he's like, I thought they were delicious.
That's amazing.
Okay, so the other thing that we ask in the new diet survey is we ask about changes in diet. And this goes back to sort of what you were mentioning about cardio or dilated cardiomyopathy. So we ask about changes in diet, both like both when and why you made changes to diet. So like some people are making dietary changes because their dogs are growing up from puppy into adult stage or adult to senior stage or something like that. But some of them are making choices around allergens or around recommendations from veterinarians. So we're collecting that information too. Okay, so before we move on to the questions, I wanted to make a quick shout out for completing the annual follow-up survey so you can see the new and improved diet section, which we're really excited about and has already been collecting data for the last 4 or 5 months. So when you get your invitation to the annual follow-up, make sure you complete that as soon as possible. Okay, another big picture question I wanted to ask you is, could you talk just a little bit about what you hope we're going to get out of this new and improved diet module that we've rolled out?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to get a lot. So let me just speak to what you just said in terms of filling out the survey. When we put this survey together, we spent quite a long time. Dr. Kaiser spent way longer than I did, but it was laborious. And we recognize also how laborious it would be for you to complete. And we tried our best to streamline that as much as possible. But then we also wanted to be careful to make sure, again, that we recognize that there are things, unfortunately, that we do need to take time to make sure that we get accurately. So we appreciate you for taking the time. We recognize it's a lot of time. It's probably one of the longest surveys, potentially. I mean, if you're just feeding a commercial dry diet, it may take you like no time. But if you're feeding a homemade diet or something like this, it may take longer if you're giving a lot of treats. So we appreciate you, because I think, ultimately we do want to start to find, we're hopeful that this project will answer or help to start to answer a lot of questions. As we just discussed, because of the wide variation in dogs, dog breed, dog ages, diets, genetics, etc., it's difficult to do a study where we answer a lot of questions related to diet. So the fact that we're going to have tens of thousands of you participating in this study really is going to help us answer some of these questions. Like I know there was a question which we'll get to, again, not to keep harping on it, but this grain-free diet situation. And the fact of the matter is we don't really know. We don't fully understand it. Copper storage hepatopathy is another big issue right now in nutrition. We don't fully understand it. And so I think my hope is that because we're gaining so much more information from all of you, we will start to help put together at least some initial answers regarding what is the implication of certain diets in the onset of these diseases. And we can make some recommendations. That's the ultimate goal, because in the end, I'm a veterinarian that is trying to treat disease. Like that's what I want out of it. I want for this study to improve the health and well-being of dogs.
Can people take their dogs to a veterinary nutritionist the way you could go to a human nutritionist?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because I do think there's sort of a misconception about what a veterinary nutritionist is. So it's important to recognize that a veterinary nutritionist has also gone to vet school. Generally speaking, has done at least an internship. If not, a lot of them will have done lots of years in clinical practice before they've done the veterinary residency. Then they do a residency, which, depending on the way that they do the residency, is usually about 2 years, but can be longer in my case because I'm also working during the time with which I'm completing the residency. So at least 2 years, if not longer. And then they sit boards. So they have to take an exam to become board certified as a veterinary nutritionist. So yes, there are nutritionists, and they do require quite a bit of education to become a nutritionist.
Cool. Thanks for clarifying that. That's great. We're going to dive into some of the questions we've collected. And I just wanted to make a little bit of a disclaimer that, our discussion is really going to focus around the big picture of how and why we study diet at the Dog Aging Project. Dr. Tolbert is not going to be providing specific dietary advice or medical advice. your primary care veterinarian is always your best partner for making specific medical decisions about your dog. And so I guess we'll dive into some of the questions. And in fact, really appreciated a post from one of our participants who expressed a sentiment that many other people have expressed, which is like, wow, I want to do what's best for my dog. I want to make sure I'm feeding them the right things. There's so much information out there, and I don't know how to deal with this like deluge of information. Who can I trust? What does my dog need? Help me help my dog be their best self. So what would be your advice for dog owners thinking about nutrition for their dogs? Resources, places to go, how to interpret all this information?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, consultation with your veterinarian is a good place to start to make sure that they agree. Like there are different diets for different stages. For example, there are different requirements for the dog depending on if they're a growing puppy or if they are pregnant or lactating or if they're adult. And sometimes we change the diet, if they're an older dog because some of the digestibility of nutrients changes with age. So I think that's the first place that you want to start is talking to your veterinarian and getting recommendations there. But if you're the kind of person that wants to read a bit more, I would encourage you to look at some of the resources that are out there from, for example, the College of Veterinary Nutrition. So you can go to the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine and then click on College of Veterinary Nutrition. And there are some resources posted there. There's some great resources from the World Small Animal Veterinary Association that you can find there. And then there's some other ones like we can talk about, and we can put in the chat for you guys. That will be some other ones that for people that are just jonesing for more info.
Super. We will put those resources on the dog park and in all the follow-up for this PAC event. So thank you for getting those links for us. All right, let's dive right into the grain-free diet issue. You want to give sort of the big picture of that?
Yes. So it's a big question to answer in a little bit of time. But okay, so basically what the story is that prior to maybe about 2014, we recognized dilated cardiomyopathy as typically a disease that affected certain breeds of dogs like Dobermans, Great Danes, for example, Portuguese water dogs. And for the most part, most of those dogs, except for the latter breed, the Portuguese water dogs, tended to be older, more male than female, and just what seemed to be a genetic disease. After about 2014, it seems like cardiologists started recognizing that they were seeing atypical breeds. So, for example, pit bulls, smaller breed dogs that they had never seen before with dilated cardiomyopathy. And then they started to gain more and more information, and then the FDA got involved. And in 2018, the FDA released a report related to the possibility that there could be an association between grain-free diets and certain grain-free diets and the development of dilated cardiomyopathy in these dogs. And since that time, there's probably been about 50 or more studies related to trying to better understand the nutritional relationship between dilated cardiomyopathy and certain diets. So what we know to date is that we don't know everything. We know that we can see it in dogs that are eating both diets that are grain-free and those that are actually not grain-free. It tends to be in diets that have a very high legume proportion in their diet. So legumes would be things like fava beans, chickpeas, green peas, those things. So we're recognizing that seems to be part of the component. And then the question is like, well, what else is coming along with that? Is there some sort of nutrient deficiency that's occurring in these diets that we haven't been able to detect? Is there something else that we're not identifying? But at the moment, we don't know the exact mechanism. We know that it happens. And the good news about it is that if you catch it early enough, it seems to be reversible.
So I have a follow-up question. So was part of the initial suspicion about diet and sort of the maybe increase in occurrence of dilated cardiomyopathy that you were seeing overlaid with sort of the dogs or wolves feed them meat kind of fad that seemed like it was sort of in the, I don't know, dog world for a while? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I think that, again, we can see a lot of dogs eat grain-free diets and be just fine. And the proportion with which dogs are eating grain-free diets does not match the proportion with which we're seeing dogs diagnosed with diabetic cardiomyopathy.
So can you clarify that just for our audience, so that lots of dogs eat grain-free diets without any issues?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Which again goes back to, it's probably more, it's not as simple as just saying it's grain-free diets.
Right.
Again, we're seeing some dogs eating diets that have grains in them. They have wheat, they have corn, etc., but they have a very high proportion of legumes. So it may be more related to the legume type stuff. And again, some of those diets are not marketed for like the I'm wild wolf, hear me roar kind of thing.
Yeah. And we had a follow-up question that was really, a question that was related, which was about allergies to grains. And so do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty rare that I find a dog that I can't feed some sort of grain. Most of the time, if they have an allergy to, let's say, wheat, I usually can feed them something like barley and sometimes even like corn. I know people think corn's a bad word, but it's not as common that I see dogs be allergic to corn. So I don't know that I answered your question, but
so I mean, maybe it's worth spending a little bit time to just getting your insights on how, as a nutritionist, you are thinking about food allergies. Because lots of people have specific questions like, oh, my dog's allergic to X, but I'm interested in sort of how you think about that with respect to overall dog health when you're in your practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I will say that we called it an adverse food reaction because a lot of times we don't see like a true allergic type disease to food components. Like they don't have that sort of like hives or immediate sensitivity or whatever. Sometimes it's a very delayed reaction. And so we call that an adverse food reaction. And so let's just talk about dogs specifically with gastrointestinal diseases. We think that about 67 to 75% of dogs with gastrointestinal diseases can improve with food. Now, that's not always because we have to change an ingredient. Like sometimes we do. So sometimes we say, okay, yeah, we got to remove the wheat or the chicken or the beef and replace it with something else. Other times it's actually because of a nutrient, like they need more fiber in their diet or they need less fat in their diet. So it's very common that we see food improve or worsen disease. It's not always from an allergy.
I'm gonna look through some of these questions and skip around a little bit because people were there are a lot of questions around what are we observing that we think in our dogs that we think might be related to diet. So whether that's allergies or food, adverse food reactions, as you were saying, or a variety of things, but things like, maybe skin issues or scratching or licking, but then also like changes in stool. And so what are the kinds of things as a clinician that you are thinking through if you have a patient that comes in with these various, with a variety of different observations they're making about their dog that they think might be related to food?
Oh, well, I mean, I think that the client is always the best witness to what's going on with their dog. So I try to really listen to them and incorporate what they think is happening in my medical recommendations. I mean, it depends on the disease. Again, for like what you're describing, cutaneous disease, so skin disease or gastrointestinal disease, I think it's really common that we see dogs have food responsive diseases. And so I'm often thinking about food. I do think that we are not very good at recognizing sometimes how food can affect other diseases. Like we can recognize it, right? Like, so if I eat a lot of carbs, I'm ready to go take a nap. Like I don't get diarrhea. I'm not itchy. I'm just really tired. And so I think probably the animals are the same exact way, where certain foods, certain ingredients can affect their overall well-being or quality of life. And so I think a lot of times, yeah, the client can be very helpful in pinpointing those events. I think sometimes we can overread it and we have to be careful about that. And work as a team. But I think a lot of times they can be the best witness to kind of helping us understand the link between the two.
We had a number of questions about variety, right? So is it a good idea to mix up food brands and flavors, stick to one? Some people are saying, I have one dog who is super happy to eat the same thing every meal, every day, and another dog who seems to get bored with their food. Curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the decision is individual. Sometimes it's more about like the human animal bond than it is about the actual dog, which is fair. Like if you feel like, because you wouldn't want to eat beef every night, you don't want your dog to eat beef every night, I can certainly understand that. For me, it's more nutrients than it is ingredients. So I mean, it goes back again. I hate to say corn because I know we're going to get some people talking about corn. But if I think about corn's an ingredient and it provides nutrients. And so I can think about the nutrients that it provides, whether it be, the amino acids that come in, the fatty acids that come in, some of the vitamins that come in. So as long as it's complete and balanced and provides all the essential vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, amino acids that the dog needs, that's all I as a nutritionist really care about. So they can eat the same diet their whole entire life. And I'm not going to mind too much. The good news about dogs, most dogs, obviously we're kind of generalizing here, as compared to cats, is that dogs are more likely to sort of be adaptable as compared to cats. They get fixed food preferences pretty early in life. And so if you feed them an exclusively canned diet when they're young, it's going to be really hard to get them on a dry diet when they're older. Dogs are usually better about, kind of mixing and matching, but that would be one thing to consider, is maybe making sure that you offer a variety of food forms so that in the event that, let's say your dog has urinary tract disease and you want to switch them from a dry diet to a canned diet, they're not going to be like, what is this?
So thing you're putting in my bowl.
Right. Exactly.
Somebody had a question, since we're talking about cat food, about whether they should be concerned if their dog is eating their cat's food.
Yeah, great question. So the good news about dogs is they can eat cat food and be just fine. Sometimes cat food can be a little bit higher in fat, so some dogs may not do as well with that, and it can be higher in protein, and some dogs, depending on the diseases they have, that may not be a good thing. But cat food contains all of the essential vitamins and minerals and amino acids that a dog needs. The opposite is not true. So you could not feed a cat a diet that was exclusively intended for dogs without causing deficiency.
Oh, that's interesting. That's cool. Let's see what looking at here. We had a question about whether it's possible for dogs to be healthy on a vegan diet.
Good question. So I would say, veganism is a bit of it's a thought process. It's a belief in a system. It's very individual. Dogs don't usually make that choice. So we say plant-based diets for dogs because generally, we can't really ask them, do you believe in veganism? Do you think we should just eat plants? Mm-hmm. So vegan diets, you have to be really, really careful because dogs are omnivores. And so their metabolism is designed to get certain nutrients from meat. And sometimes it can be difficult for them to obtain some of those essential nutrients from plant-based sources. So there are diets that are vegan that may be acceptable for dogs, but the risk is higher in terms of you want to make sure that you're using a really reputable company. You may need to do a bit more monitoring, like in terms of checking the overall health of your dog, recognizing that you're taking a bit of more of a risk in terms of things like calcium availability, vitamin D availability, essential amino acids in the diet. So you can cause disease in dogs by feeding a vegan diet that's not appropriately balanced for the dog. So you have to be very careful. Can you do it in the right way? Yes, absolutely. If you want to do a vegan-based diet, I would encourage you to work with a veterinary nutritionist so that they can help you do that more safely. The same thing like raw, like everyone should make their own choices for themselves and for their dogs. It's just about education. So, you can do raw in a really not great way, or you can try to make raw a bit safer. And there are ways to feed raw more safely, and veterinary nutritionists can help guide you in how to do that.
Several times you've mentioned whatever the diet is, right? Wanting a full and balanced, complete and balanced diet. Is that the kind of thing that a person's primary care veterinarian can help them assess? Like, this is what I'm feeding my dog. Are we hitting all of the right boxes?
Yeah, I think working with your veterinarian is a really great idea, and you should always do that. The other thing that you can do is make sure you're reading the label. So you want to make sure that the label has an AAFCO adequacy statement. So that's AAFCO, American Association of Feed Control Officials. And that's a regulatory body that sort of lists the things that should be in the diet, and to make sure that the diet is actually meeting the requirements for the dog. You also want to make sure that when you're looking at the label that it's intended for the stage of life that your dog is currently in, whether that be a puppy or even a large breed puppy, whether that be adult, that sort of thing. So making sure that you pay attention to that. Lastly, if you really want to do your due diligence, one thing you can look for is whether or not the diet has undergone feeding trials. So a diet can have an AAFCO adequacy statement in few different ways, but the main two are what's called a feeding trial, where the diet is actually fed to a puppy or an adult for a certain period of time, and then they monitor to make sure that that individual is still healthy following the feeding trial. Or it can be what's called calculated. And calculated means that they sort of put it all in a computer generator and say, okay, it should meet the requirements that a dog needs in terms of those essential nutrients. So it's always better if you have the option to do a feeding trial. Sometimes you don't, and that's okay, but you want to make sure that it's certainly minimally AAFCO adequate.
I think this is probably a good point in our conversation to circle back to something you said earlier, which I thought was really important, right? Which is that there's a lot going on here, right? We've got lots of genetic variety in dogs, lots of dietary variety in dogs, and there is not necessarily a one size fits all solution, right? People get passionate about particular kinds of diets in a lot of ways because it's something that is working really well for their individual dog, but that doesn't mean it's the right solution for everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really important statement, because I think, we have to be able to have a conversation. And my beliefs may not be the same as yours, but we have to be able to come to the table and talk about, how do we support each other? How do we make this the best we possibly can? And so even if you're doing something that I might not do for my own dog, we still have to be able to talk about it.
And it's one thing we're really excited about in our new diet survey, because we're really going to be able to get into a lot of these details about specific supplements and how those may be interacting, or specific nutritional components, right? How those may be interacting with what we're seeing in health history, what we're seeing in the genetics profiles that we do on dogs. So
exactly. And I mean, I think one more comment is just to say that we don't have an agenda.
Yeah,
report the data. That's all we want is to report the data. We don't have an agenda one way or another. We just want to put out the science.
I appreciate you reminding our audience about that. It sort of circles back to where we were at the beginning, which is there's so much information. We don't know kind of how to process it. And worth just reminding everybody that the Dog Aging Project is a nonprofit study. We're not associated with any corporations or corporate interests. And we are grant funded, and we're here for the science, right? Figuring out what's going to work best for all of our dogs. Let's see. I know we only have a couple more minutes, but I'm going to just skim through these questions and see if there are some main ones we haven't talked about. Oh, this was an interesting about kind of food storage safety, right? Just be curious about your thoughts about how, should I buy a year's supply of kibble and keep it in my garage? Or should I be, using one bag and then getting another one? Are there any particular food safety things that dog owners should be thinking about?
Yeah, and I'm going to be a little bit outside my element in answering this question. So you might hear something from somebody who actually works for a pet manufacturer, and I would definitely trust them more. But I think, a couple things to remember. There's always an expiration date on whatever, or there should be on whatever you're feeding your dog. And so making sure that you're following the expiration date. Sometimes it would always be helpful if you're able to actually cut out, even if you don't keep it in the bag of dog food, you actually put it in a Tupperware bin, and you want to make sure it's a closed system that's protected from moisture. Obviously not undergoing any extreme heat or extreme freezing. So if you can keep it indoors, that's always better. If you don't keep it in the original bag, which sometimes some pet foods are actually intended to be kept in their original bag, like things that are really high in omega-3 fatty acids, for example, often have like joint diets often have a special bag that they're meant to stay in. If you don't have one of those diets and you want to pour it into a Tupperware storage container, then what would be ideal is actually if you would cut out the bag that says the lot number and the expiration date. That's really helpful whenever you have food recalls, so that you can actually look at your own bag of dog food and make sure that it's not one of those. So that's what I would recommend.
Also helpful when you fill out the annual follow-up survey, because we ask you to put in the barcode of your dog's food.
Right, that's right.
Here's another good question that I think is worth discussing. Is there a measurement for dogs that is comparable to BMI score for humans?
Yeah, there are a couple of different ways to score. We usually use something called a body condition score. And so that is more of sort of a visual and a palpation technique, where we look at the amount of excess body fat, or maybe not enough body fat, on a dog. And we do that by, like I said, palpating them, but also looking at the top of their spine and looking from the side of you. And we usually use a 9-point system, with 4 or 5 being ideal in the dog.
Cool. It's interesting how many, you sort of alluded to it before, but how there is we have such a strong emotional bond with our dogs, right? And so food and eating is also sort of associated with that relationship that we have with our dog, right? Like it's Gilda's birthday, I'm going to take her for a pup cup or whatever I'm going to do, right? And so we do ask questions in a couple different places in the Health and Life Experience survey about like whether dogs have ever been underweight or overweight. Perhaps it's worth saying that we don't, again, have any judgment associated with those sorts of things. We're trying to get a sense of health history for the dogs, because that may be informative for us to understand conditions that might arise later in life. And I am thinking that this is probably we've addressed most of the questions. Some of your questions that you submitted were pretty specific. We'll do our best to answer some of those on the dog park forum. But maybe the best way to close is to think about, is to just talk in general about how, what am I going to say? What was I going to ask you? Sort of going back to eating behaviors, I think, right? So some people had some questions about, dogs who are super food motivated versus dogs that kind of maybe seem like they're picky eaters, or they eat when they feel like it. We asked questions about feeding frequency and also like free feeding, because that works for some dogs. So do you have any sort of general thoughts about how you interpret some of those feeding behaviors?
Yeah, for me, it's more about the history. So if I hear an animal, I mean, I used to have a dog like this, where you could leave out the bowl of dog food and the dog wouldn't eat it until like it had been down for 14 hours, and then she would finally eat it. Versus I have a golden retriever right now, and like you can go about 30 seconds before it's completely So for me, it's about the recent history. Has something changed? Like, did they go from actually snarfing their food, and now they'll eat all of their food, but it takes them all day. I think recognizing some of the changes in feeding behaviors is a very early indicator that something's wrong, and sometimes that can actually happen before anything else is detectable. So it's like that thing where you're like, I don't think something's right, and you're sort of like, I wonder if I should take my dog to the vet. I think you should, trust yourself that if you feel like something's wrong, something may be wrong, and it's always a good idea to be evaluated in that case.
It's a great place to end. We're a community science project, which means we're depending on our participants to be the experts on their dogs and to pay attention to all of those things and then report them back to us on surveys. So I'm glad we're ending there. Thank you so much for being with me today for this conversation. There was a lot of interest in the topic. We may, harass you into coming back and talking to us again in a year. We can talk about the collection on a new module. Yeah.
There we go.
So for our audience out there, we will post a follow-up with some of the links that Dr. Tolbert mentioned. We'll try to follow up on all the questions. But again, if they were pretty specific, we're going to direct you to your primary care veterinarian for your specific needs. And just to give you another shout out that most of you will be receiving the invitation for your annual follow-up pretty soon. It happens on your PAC anniversary date, but the biggest chunk of our participants usually are getting those in the fall. Everybody also should have recently received an invitation to complete the Canine Social and Learned Behavior Survey, which we send out in September. So please make sure you complete that. Go into your research portal. That's a quick one. It takes 8 to 10 minutes to do. And then the other thing I wanted to tell everybody is that the Dog Aging Project held our annual meeting in Seattle last week. And next month, we're going to be talking about all of the different scientific presentations that we saw at that meeting and lots of the new results we have coming. So reminder to enter the giveaway on the dog park. The link is below this video. All you have to do to enter is comment or question for Dr. Tolbert. And thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that was fun. Thank you.
All right, now I'm going to go for a pup cup. Thanks a lot. Take care.
All right.